On a chilly January evening in 2024, in a seemingly peaceful neighborhood of New Orleans, Louisiana, lived Lillian Gray, a 35-year-old woman, with her husband, Daniel Gray, age 40. They had been married for 15 years, and theirs was a union admired by everyone around them. To the neighbors, they were the model couple, inseparable, supportive, and deeply in love. It was the kind of relationship everyone aspired to have, a marriage that seemed untouched by the trials of life, steadfast through every season. Their daughter, Sophia, an 18-year-old college freshman, was coming home for winter break. This homecoming was a source of joy and anticipation for the family. Sophia was the perfect mix of her parents, both in looks and temperament, and Lillian couldn't wait to have her under the same roof again. She meticulously prepared for Sophia's arrival, decorating the home, preparing her daughter's favorite dishes, and reminiscing about the years that had passed so quickly. Daniel, too, was excited. He spent hours getting Sophia's room ready, arranging it just the way she left it so it would feel familiar and comforting. On January 4th, Lillian and Daniel decided to host a small gathering of friends and family to celebrate Sophia's return. The house was alive with laughter and the clinking of glasses. People filled every corner of their cozy home, exchanging stories and toasts to the new year. Daniel was the picture of the doting husband and father, holding Lillian and Sophia close, radiating the warmth that everyone had come to associate with the Gray family. For those looking in, it was the quintessential family scene, loved ones gathered, smiles exchanged, and an air of joy filling every room. But as the night progressed, Lillian noticed something subtle, something unsettling. In brief moments, she saw Daniel and Sophia exchange glances, looks so fleeting that no one else seemed to notice. There was nothing inherently strange about a father and daughter sharing a moment, but Lillian felt a pang of unease she couldn't explain. She brushed it off as exhaustion from hosting or perhaps the high emotions of Sophia's return. When the party ended and the house fell quiet, life seemed to settle back into its usual rhythm. Daniel went back to work, and Lillian slipped into her familiar routines of running the household. Sophia spent her days relaxing at home, laughing with her parents, catching up on family stories, and preparing for her second semester. From the outside, everything appeared as harmonious as ever. Yet, for Lillian, that flicker of discomfort lingered. When Daniel offered to take Sophia into town for errands or to meet friends, Lillian would watch them go, feeling a strange tug in her chest. She tried to convince herself it was nothing, that she was simply overthinking. After all, Daniel and Sophia had always been close. Perhaps too close. Her mind grappled with this thought, fighting off the sense of dread that would settle over her late at night. As the days went on, Lillian began to question everything she knew about her family. A shadow crept into her thoughts, a quiet suspicion that refused to be silenced. Was it all in her head, or was there something shifting, something hidden beneath the facade of her perfect family? Little did she know, this feeling was just the beginning. Lillian was about to unearth a truth that would turn her world upside down, leaving her wondering if she ever truly knew the people she loved. The perfect life she thought she had might be nothing more than a well-crafted illusion, and soon, that illusion would shatter in ways she never could have imagined. By early February, barely a month after Sophia's return, Lillian's sense of unease grew stronger with each passing day. Little details began to catch her attention, and they gnawed at her relentlessly. Daniel and Sophia seemed inseparable, spending more time together than she remembered. But it wasn't the typical father-daughter bond she had grown accustomed to seeing. They would vanish into Sophia's room, speaking in hushed tones behind closed doors, leaving Lillian feeling like an outsider in her own home. They still shared laughter at the dinner table, but there was a veil, a subtle disconnect that left Lillian questioning her place within the family she had once felt so secure in. One night, during a quiet dinner, Lillian noticed a brief, yet strangely intimate glance pass between Daniel and Sophia. It was a small thing, barely a flicker in the air, but Lillian felt it deeply. An unwelcome feeling of anxiety settled in her chest. She tried to dismiss it, reasoning that they were merely reconnecting after months of separation. Daniel adored Sophia, always had, perhaps he was just being an attentive father. But these silent exchanges became more frequent, and sometimes conversations would come to an abrupt halt the moment Lillian entered the room. By February 6, Lillian's suspicions weighed heavily on her. That night, she woke in the dark, reaching over to Daniel's side of the bed only to find it empty. Figuring he had gone downstairs for a glass of water, she quietly slipped out of bed and made her way to the kitchen. But as she passed Sophia's room, she noticed a faint light spilling out from under the door. Curiosity piqued, she crept closer and heard the murmur of voices. Her heart began to race as she gently knocked on the door. Silence fell inside, and after a brief pause, Daniel opened the door with a warm smile, explaining that Sophia couldn't sleep and had asked him to sit with her. Lillian forced a smile, suppressing the wave of discomfort that surged within her. She returned to bed, but the image of Daniel in Sophia's room, in the dead of night, haunted her thoughts. Over the next week, their closeness only grew, and Lillian's doubts gnawed at her relentlessly. On February 11, over a casual lunch, Daniel suggested that he and Sophia take a day trip into town, on a day Lillian had already planned to meet with friends. "Just the two of us," he said, casting a brief glance at Sophia, who smiled and readily agreed. Lillian swallowed her discomfort, painting a smile on her face as she assured herself it was just an innocent father-daughter outing. Yet, a knot formed in her stomach that refused to loosen. Then, on February 16, Lillian returned home earlier than expected from work. As she stepped through the door, she heard the faint sound of laughter echoing from the living room. She paused and peeked in, seeing Daniel and Sophia seated closely on the couch, their heads bent over something on Sophia's phone. They seemed so absorbed in their own world, laughing in a way that felt both familiar and alien. The moment they realized she was there, Sophia's smile faded, and Daniel quickly stood, his expression tense. "You're home early," he said, his voice faltering. At that moment, the doubts Lillian had tried to suppress bubbled over into a wave of suspicion that nearly overwhelmed her. She could no longer brush off the glances, the secrets, the subtle changes in their behavior. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and her instincts told her that the family she once trusted implicitly was hiding something from her, something dark and consuming. As mid-February approached, Lillian found herself lying awake night after night, reliving every suspicious glance, every whisper that had ceased when she entered the room. The once steady foundation of her marriage began to crack under the weight of her doubts, and the home she had cherished began to feel foreign, even dangerous. Every moment alone with her thoughts only intensified her dread. Lillian knew she could no longer ignore her instincts, no longer pretend everything was as it seemed. But what Lillian didn't yet realize was that her suspicions were only scratching the surface of a truth far more disturbing than she could ever imagine. The cracks in her seemingly perfect life were only beginning to show, and soon, they would burst open, shattering her world into pieces. She was standing on the edge of a revelation that would change everything, a truth so dark and twisted that it would make her question everything she thought she knew about her husband, her daughter, and herself. Lillian was about to find out that some secrets are better left buried, because once uncovered, they can never be forgotten. On February 18, the delicate web of Lillian's suspicions finally unraveled. She had planned to work a long shift, giving Daniel and Sophia the day to themselves. But an unexpected change in her schedule allowed her to come home early. As she quietly opened the front door, Lillian hoped to surprise her family, anticipating they'd be out running errands. Instead, the soft sound of laughter drifted down the hallway, guiding her to the living room. She stopped short as she took in the scene. There, on the couch, Daniel and Sophia sat close together, their heads nearly touching as they laughed over something on Daniel's phone. They hadn't noticed her presence yet, lost in a moment that felt strangely intimate. But when Sophia glanced up, her smile faltered, and she pulled back, her face paling as her eyes met Lillian's. Daniel quickly stood, clearing his throat and forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You're home early," he said, his voice strained, betraying the tension that filled the room. Lillian managed a forced smile in return, barely able to hide the storm brewing inside her. She mumbled about a schedule change, then headed to the kitchen, her hands trembling and her mind racing. For the first time, Lillian's suspicions felt undeniable. This was no longer a figment of her imagination. The glances, the secrecy, and now this, something deeply unsettling was happening between her husband and her daughter. She could feel it with every fiber of her being, yet she still lacked concrete proof. But now, her suspicions were no longer mere whispers in her mind, they were a dark certainty she couldn't shake. In the days that followed, Lillian's behavior shifted as she became more watchful, each day noticing new details that only deepened her dread. Daniel and Sophia continued to share those brief, secretive looks over dinner. Conversations hushed when she entered the room, and a strange tension filled the air whenever the three of them were together. What had once been a comforting father-daughter bond now felt tainted, twisted into something Lillian could barely comprehend. Her heart ached as she grappled with the horrifying possibility looming in the shadows of her mind. On February 22, with Daniel at work and Sophia out for the afternoon, Lillian felt a surge of determination. She had waited long enough. The unsettling thoughts in her mind demanded answers, and she could no longer live with the doubts plaguing her every waking moment. Heart pounding, she walked to Daniel's study, where he often left his phone. She'd never once violated his privacy, trusting him completely over the years. But today was different. Today, trust had been replaced by a need for truth. With trembling hands, she unlocked Daniel's phone using the passcode she had memorized but never intended to use. The screen opened, and she took a steadying breath as she began to scroll through his messages. Most were mundane, work emails, group chats with friends, the usual exchanges she'd come to expect. But as she scrolled further, her eye caught a familiar name, Sophia. A sense of dread washed over her as she opened their conversation, her pulse quickening. The beginning of their messages was innocent enough, conversations about college and errands. But as she delved deeper, a message dated February 18 stopped her cold. It read, "I miss our time alone together." Lillian's hands went numb, her mind reeling as she read and reread the words, hoping she had misinterpreted them. But the message was as clear as it was haunting. Her worst fears, the ones she tried so desperately to ignore, now stared back at her in black and white. Lillian felt the room close in around her, her breath shallow as the full weight of realization sank in. This was no innocent father-daughter bond. It was something that shattered her world, twisting everything she thought she knew about her family into a horrific nightmare. The life she had built, the love she had trusted, lay in ruins before her. And now, there was no going back, only forward, into the dark truth she had uncovered. The message replayed in Lillian's mind, a relentless echo that twisted her thoughts into a storm of anger, disbelief, and betrayal. How long had this secret been festering within her own family? How could Daniel, her husband, her partner of 15 years, betray her in such a vile way? And Sophia, the daughter she had loved and raised with unwavering devotion, was part of it all. The betrayal felt like a knife turning in her chest, leaving her gasping for answers. The next day, Lillian couldn't keep her emotions from simmering beneath the surface, but she was careful. She wasn't ready to reveal what she knew. Instead, she scrutinized Daniel, watching for the slightest slip, waiting for him to falter. Daniel, oblivious to her knowledge, greeted her warmly, kissed her cheek, and spoke to her as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed for Lillian. Her love for him had morphed into a volatile mixture of heartbreak and fury, a simmering rage that threatened to spill over. By February 25, Lillian could no longer bear the weight of her suspicions. The facade of normalcy Daniel and Sophia maintained was too much to endure. She decided to dig deeper, to uncover more than just the message that had shattered her initial trust. That afternoon, when Daniel and Sophia left for what they claimed was a quick trip to the store, Lillian seized her chance. She went straight to Sophia's room, her hands trembling as she searched through her daughter's belongings. Hidden beneath Sophia's bed, Lillian found a small box. Inside lay the evidence she feared, but needed to see for herself: handwritten notes, love letters penned in Daniel's unmistakable handwriting. As she read one note, dated February 14, Valentine's Day, Lillian's heart shattered all over again. The words read, "You are the meaning of my life." Her vision blurred with tears, and her hands shook as the reality set in. This wasn't just a fleeting indiscretion, it was a hidden relationship, a double life that had unfolded right under her nose. The secretive glances, the late-night whispers, the warmth that had once seemed innocent, it all pointed to one horrifying truth. Daniel and Sophia had betrayed her in a way she could never have imagined, and the pain was nearly unbearable. But beneath the heartbreak, Lillian felt something else rising, an anger that surged through her with overwhelming intensity. How could they do this to her? How could they destroy everything she had spent years building, tearing apart the very fabric of their family? Lillian knew she couldn't confront them immediately. She needed time to process, to plan. This wasn't something she could forgive, nor would she ever forget. Alone in Sophia's room, clutching the love notes in her hands, Lillian made a silent vow. They would face the consequences of this betrayal. She didn't know how or when, but the fire within her burned too fiercely to be extinguished. For now, she would wait, but the rage was growing, swelling with each passing day. By early March 2024, Lillian had reached her breaking point. Every smile, every word Daniel and Sophia exchanged felt like an insult, fueling the inferno inside her. She had all the proof she needed: the messages, the love notes, the memories of suspicious glances and whispered conversations. There was no escaping the truth: Daniel and Sophia had crossed an unforgivable line. Lillian's once peaceful home had become a prison of betrayal, and she knew she couldn't endure it any longer. On March 5, she made a decision. She couldn't live with this pain in silence, drowning in her own anguish while they acted as if nothing had happened. She needed to confront them, to force them to acknowledge the devastation they had caused. That evening, as Daniel and Sophia returned from another outing, Lillian steeled herself. She caught their attention and told them they needed to talk. "We need to discuss our relationships," she said, her voice eerily calm, yet laced with ice. Daniel and Sophia exchanged a quick, apprehensive glance but nodded in agreement. As they settled into the living room, Lillian watched them closely, her face composed, concealing the rage and betrayal that simmered within her. She wasn't sure what she'd say next or how they would react, but one thing was certain: they would face the truth. The lies, the deception, Lillian wouldn't allow them to continue living in their web of secrets. In that moment, she felt her anger reach a fever pitch, knowing that whatever happened next, her life, and theirs, would never be the same. The three of them sat in the living room, the silence thick and suffocating, wrapping around them like a dark fog. Lillian's heart thundered in her chest, her fury simmering beneath the calm mask she fought to hold. Daniel glanced around nervously, and with a strained smile, he tried to steer the conversation into casual waters. But Lillian had no patience left for small talk. Without hesitation, she pulled out her phone and pushed it across the table, the incriminating messages lighting up the screen. "Explain this," she demanded, her voice like ice. Daniel's face went pale as he looked down at the messages. He opened his mouth, but no words came. He sat there, speechless, while Sophia sat motionless beside him, her gaze fixed on her lap, her face ghostly. "It's not what you think," Daniel finally stammered, his voice barely above a whisper, shaky with desperation. "It's all a misunderstanding." Lillian's patience snapped, her voice rising, the fury breaking through her restraint. "A misunderstanding? Do you think I'm a fool?" Her voice was sharp, unforgiving. "I've seen the messages, Daniel, the notes, the looks, the whispers. You've been lying to me for months." Sophia remained silent, tears brimming in her eyes as she stared down, her shoulders trembling with the weight of Lillian's words. Daniel, reaching out to her, tried to touch Lillian's hand, but she recoiled instantly, as though his very touch was poison. "Don't touch me," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. I want the truth. No lies. No more excuses. I deserve to know everything. An unbearable silence filled the room, pressing down on them with the weight of all that had been left unsaid. Daniel's head hung low, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find words. Finally, his voice came out, defeated and hollow. All right, he whispered, his spirit crushed. Something has been happening between Sophia and me. But it was a mistake. A mistake. Lillian's voice was barely her own, thick with hurt and betrayal. This mistake has been going on for months. And you think this is something I can just forgive? Daniel didn't answer, shame written in every line of his face. Sophia, silently sobbing, clutched her arms around herself, as if she could hide from the truth of what they'd done. Lillian could take it no longer. The betrayal, this horrifying, soul-crushing betrayal, was too much. She shot to her feet, her chair scraping across the floor as it toppled backward. Her vision blurred, rage consuming her entirely. I gave you everything, she said, her voice breaking with the weight of her anguish. I loved you both, and this is how you repay me. Her voice cracked, the enormity of her loss settling heavily in her heart. She had trusted them, her own family, and they had torn her world apart. Neither Daniel nor Sophia replied, both silenced by shame and guilt. The room grew unbearably still, suffocating in its silence, until Lillian could feel herself slipping away, her spirit fractured, broken beyond repair. She couldn't stay here, not in this house that now felt more like a prison than a home. Every corner, every memory, felt tainted, darkened by their betrayal. On March 12, Lillian made her decision. She couldn't keep carrying the crushing weight of their deceit. It had consumed her every waking thought, twisted her heart into something unrecognizable. She was done grieving, done pleading, done feeling powerless in the face of their betrayal. In her mind, a plan began to form, sharp and clear. She would take control, regain the power she had lost to their secrets. She didn't know precisely how, but she knew one thing for sure: Daniel and Sophia would face the consequences of what they had done. This was no longer a matter of forgiveness or reconciliation. It was a matter of justice, and Lillian was prepared to do whatever it took to make sure they paid for the destruction they had wrought upon her life. There was no going back, and in her heart, Lillian knew it. She would never forgive them, never rebuild the trust that had once held their family together. Now, there was only the quiet, determined resolve of a woman who had been pushed to her breaking point. Lillian wasn't the same person she had been just weeks before. That woman was gone, shattered by betrayal. Now, all that remained was a simmering fury, a need for reckoning that would soon make itself known. In the days that followed her decision, Lillian moved with a quiet determination, each step a calculated preparation. Daniel and Sophia still clung to the illusion that they could somehow move forward, as if the damage they had caused could be erased by time or words. But Lillian was long past caring for their empty gestures and false apologies. Her calm demeanor and purposeful movements through the house unsettled them, yet neither Daniel nor Sophia dared to confront her. They sensed the change in her, a simmering silence that warned them to tread carefully. By April 17, Lillian was ready. She suggested they have one final family dinner, a chance to talk openly and resolve things together. Daniel, eager to smooth things over, agreed, and Sophia, despite her visible discomfort, followed his lead. That evening, Lillian set the table with meticulous care, arranging their favorite dishes and lighting candles. The meal looked beautiful, almost serene, an unsettling contrast to the tension filling the room. Daniel and Sophia attempted small talk, casting uncertain glances toward Lillian, who responded with brief nods, her gaze fixed on them both with an unsettling calm. The quiet was heavy, as if the very air around them held its breath. Finally, Daniel couldn't bear the tension any longer. He leaned forward, his voice tentative. Lillian, I know things have been strained. But we can get through this. We can start over, rebuild what's been broken. Lillian's expression remained unreadable. Without a word, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the folded note she had found in Sophia's room, the love note, unmistakably penned in Daniel's handwriting. She placed it deliberately in front of them. "Read it," she said softly, her voice emotionless yet sharp enough to cut through the air. Daniel's face turned ashen as he recognized the note. His hands trembled as he picked it up, his mouth opening, but no words came. Lillian Gray slowly, her chair scraping against the floor with a harsh finality. "No more lies," she said, her voice rising with each word, her calm facade crumbling to reveal the fury and grief that had consumed her. "You've destroyed this family." In a flash, Lillian reached for the knife on the table, her hand trembling, her face contorted with rage and heartbreak. Daniel's eyes widened in panic, and he tried to reach for her, to stop her, but her movements were driven by the pain and betrayal that had been festering inside her for weeks. The world seemed to move in slow motion as she advanced, the room filled with gasps, cries, and chaos that blurred into a cacophony of sound and motion. At precisely 8:17 p.m., silence fell over the house once more. Lillian stood motionless, her hands stained with blood, looking down at Daniel's lifeless form. Sophia knelt beside him, her broken sobs echoing through the stillness, but it was too late. Daniel's eyes were closed, his body utterly still. Lillian, frozen in place, released the knife from her hand, the clang echoing across the empty room. The realization of what she had done hit her all at once, a tidal wave of horror and grief. She backed away, her body collapsing onto the floor, her mind numb as the weight of her actions crushed down upon her. In the distance, she heard the faint sound of sirens drawing nearer, yet inside the house, everything was already in ruins. The family she had once believed unbreakable had been shattered, leaving nothing but silence and the remains of a love betrayed. As the sirens drew closer, Lillian sat there in the desolate quiet, surrounded by the echoes of her shattered world. The once perfect family portrait had turned into a nightmare from which there was no escape, and all that remained was a devastating stillness, a void left by the irrevocable actions of a love and trust torn apart.